Good morning. I'm James Schmeling. I'm the President and CEO of the National Defense University Foundation. Thank you for joining this session with us today. I'd like to start by thanking two of our sponsors for making this series possible. We've got Leidos and Vion. Both of those corporations have donated to the University Foundation so that we can bring this series of 10 or 11 so far to you. We'd like to thank General Raymond for agreeing to do this session. We have something over 200 folks registered from all over the world, including students, faculty, staff, alumni, government representatives, and corporations, and we'd like this to be a discussion and question and answer. All of our questions and answers will be asked through the chat, and I will moderate the session. We will be recording this session, and this session will be available afterwards. Thank you very much. Admiral Rogi, over to you. Thank you, sir.
Okay, well, thank you, James, for that kind introduction, and of course for hosting today. The NDU Foundation is one of the university's most important partners, and their sponsorship of webinars like this is but one small aspect of that support. Now, this webinar marks our 11th national security briefing, and it's through these kinds of discussions with experts like General Raymond that we gain valuable perspectives on national and global security issues. And I really want to emphasize that every one of you joining us here today is also one of our partners because of our shared interest in the security of our nation. Much like the dialogue in our classrooms, these discussions enable us to come together and build an understanding of the different points of view that are essential to our education mission. Now, I see that many of you have participated in earlier briefings, so to you, welcome back. And for those of you today who are joining us today who are new to this series, let me offer just a quick word about your National Defense University. I'm certain that this crowd appreciates that we live in an increasingly complex, dynamic, and uncertain world. The United States faces many competitors and threats to our security. In fact, competitors are investing heavily to try to erode our technological advantages. So it's really important that NDU be able to create intellectual advantage by developing leaders who can outthink our competitors. So it's NDU's mission to prepare today's rising national security leaders across military, government, and industry. NDU students will be the decision makers that our nation and our allies will depend upon tomorrow, from domains from the undersea to outer space. Our students are in equal parts military members of the U.S. Armed Services, civilians from U.S. government departments and agencies, and on our campus this year we have over 120 international students from 65 friendly partner and allied nations. And if we do well at our education mission, then these students will graduate with the ability to launch the kinds of ideas that could preclude the need to launch weapons. And so the lasting measure of our success is in the peace and security enjoyed by the United States and our friends, partners, and allies. In the words of former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, education is quite simply peace building by another name. It is the most effective form of defense spending there is. So let me then suggest that if you would want the leaders of your national security enterprise, the key decision makers contributing to your peace and security, if you would want them ideally to be well educated in how to do so, then you should not only be partners of NDU, but also our advocates. And I hope that that will encourage you all to learn more about the Chairman's University, your National Defense University. So now on behalf of NDU, I want to thank General J. Raymond for joining us to provide insight into the space domain and the United States Space Force's mission and initiatives and impact and contributions to national security. It's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce you all to General J. Raymond, our nation's first Chief of Space Operations for the United States Space Force. General.
Good morning, Fritz and Dr. Schmeling. Thank you very much for hosting me today. And I'm really excited for the opportunity to be able to share a few thoughts. And what I thought I would do, if it's okay, is I'll start off by giving a few remarks just to set the stage for what I hope will become a robust dialogue back and forth, because I really would like to engage in that conversation. As I view this, today represents probably one of the most defining periods in our national defense posture. There's probably that environment. Probably we haven't seen that kind of significant change probably in a generation, and in space it might be a couple generations. What I know is that space underpins every bit of our national power, and we are strongest when that space domain is stable, secure, for our nation to fuel capabilities that fuel our American way of life, and for capabilities that fuel our American way of war. it is clear today that space is a warfighting domain, just like air, land, and sea. As I mentioned earlier in another session, that I couldn't have said that 5 or 6 years ago in a public setting. We didn't want space to become a warfighting domain, and we still, frankly, don't today. But adversaries have a vote, and clearly, Russia and China are developing capabilities to kind of two pieces. One is to have space capabilities for their own use, so they have the same advantage that we have enjoyed over the last decades of integrating space to great effect. And then the second thing that they're developing is developing a pretty significant set of threats that would threaten our ability to access our space capabilities. Everything from reversible jamming on one end all the way up to kinetic destruction on the other hand. And so the United States, over the course of the last year and a little bit, did two things. We reestablished United States Space Command as the warfighting command for space. It used to be part of U.S. Strategic Command up until August of 2019, when we took it out from underneath U.S. Strategic Command and established a separate combatant command. I had the privilege of leading that combatant command up until this past August. And General Jim Dickinson is now the commander of U.S. Space Command. A couple months later, in December of 2019, a few months later, in December of 2019, we established the United States Space Force to elevate the organized, train, and equip pieces of space from a major command underneath the United States Air Force, as part of the United States Air Force, to its own independent service. And today what you have is very analogous to the Marine Corps model, where on the Navy side, you have a Secretary of the Navy with a Commandant of the Marine Corps and a Chief of Naval Operations. On the Department of the Air Force side, now you have a Secretary of the Air Force that has a Chief of Staff of the Air Force and a Chief of Space Operations. As I look at, why would a country stand up a separate service? The reason why we did was to elevate space to the level of importance to our national security. And if you look at what independent services need to do, there's a handful of things, in my opinion. First, you have to develop your own people. And that's why this session today is so important with National Defense University, because you're a critical part of that education of our joint and coalition force. The second thing you have to do is you have to have your own doctrine. And we just published our own doctrine. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I'd urge you to get a copy of it. It's called Space Power. It's an independent view of space power is our doctrine. Very similar to what the Air Force did in 1947. Leading up to 1947, there was an Air Corps tactical school where experts got together and developed a theory of air power that grew into then the foundation of this service. So we've done that on the space side. The other thing that you have to do is you have to have your own budget. And over this course of this past year, we've taken all the dollars that were associated with space out of the Air Force and put them into the Space Force. And we have our own budget. We just submitted our POM and our budget for the first time as an independent service over the last couple of months. The other thing you have to do is you have to design your force. And so one of the things that our big focus area is on this coming year is to do that force design that brings unity of effort across the Department of Defense and with our allied partners to be able to develop a force that can operate effectively in a contested environment. And then fifth, once you design that force, you have to present those forces to a combatant command. And so we're also working new force presentation methodology, because today the way space forces are presented is through the air component. And it's really focused on the CENTCOM fight, not a national defense strategy focused conflict. And so those are kind of the 5 things that I see an independent service needs to do. To get after those 5 things, we've got some lines of effort that we're working. First of all, we're going to build this service. And the first year has really all been about creating this service. And I use the term create or invent this service purposely, because it's not just business out as how we've done business in the past. It's building something new with a clean sheet of paper. And so we built the service to be light, lean, and agile. We do not want to be big. We have to go fast. If you look at the challenges that we face in the space domain with the size and the scope of the domain, you have to move at speed. And so you've seen us do the largest restructure of the space enterprise in our history, and have flattened already 2 layers of command and flattened our staff here at the Pentagon from a planned number of over 1,000 to a plan number that gets us to 600 over the next couple of years. We're also needing to develop joint and coalition warfighters. And again, this is why NDU, it's so important that I talk to NDU. I will tell you the one thing I can say for certain is that nobody that comes to your schools understands the space domain to the level that they need to understand space domain to be successful in their business. And it's not just space, it's the whole multi-domain aspect of warfare going forward. And you have an opportunity to be the leaders in that effort, and we need you to be leaders in that effort. It requires, from my perspective in the space domain, developing space operators that have a better understanding of the joint environment, and to have what you and I might consider more traditional joint warfighters that have a better understanding of space. We have to build capabilities at operationally relevant speeds, and in your schools, you can help us with that as well. We are moving too slow, and if you look at how long it takes us to build a clone of a capability that we already have on our orbit, we're talking 5 to 6 years for a clone, not fast enough. And so we want to capitalize on again, a bad word to use in the space business, but the explosion of commercial space companies and our large partners in defense contractors to be able to move at speed. One of the ways that we're going to get it after that is to shift towards a digital engineering model. We want to build this service as a digital service up front. That means having a digital headquarters, having people on the force that are digitally fluent, and third, developing this digital engineering and adopting this digital engineering standard as our model for all acquisitions going forward, and that's what we've done. The other thing that we have to do is we have to integrate with partners, and we've got to integrate with our joint and coalition partners. Historically, for our allies that are on the net today, our partners, we haven't had the partnerships in space that we've needed to, because in the past we really didn't need to. It was a benign, peaceful domain, and there wasn't a threat. That's not the case today, and we're hard at work at developing those partnerships, and I'm really proud of that line of effort. It's probably the area that we've made the most significant gains over the last several years. Again, I appreciate the opportunity. What I'd like to do now is use that to kind of prime the pump for questions and look forward to a good dialogue as we go forward. Thank you.
General Raymond, this is Bill Bender. I'm late to join, but certainly have been in on your comments here. I've had all kinds of challenges over here at Leidos today as a sponsor of this event. And so, but I have had an opportunity to collect a number of questions that I'd like to share with you, if I may.
Sure, I'd love to. Thanks.
Yeah, so a lot of interest, obviously, in SDA, MDA, SMC for inclusion and use of Intel community data. I know that you, in your role as the Air Force Space Command Commander, really inspired a lot of partnership. Could you talk a little bit about, the importance of that in some of our joint programs and projects, and specifically as it relates to Space Force working with NRO?
Absolutely. Well, I would. First of all, it's great to see. And glad your computer
finally made it.
Yeah, got up to speed and got on the net. First of all, the partnership that we enjoy today with the National Reconnaissance Office has never been better. We've worked that very, very hard over the course of the last handful of years, and today we share a strategy, we share a ConOps. We share an operations center. We share people. About a significant number of space professionals from the Space Force and the Air Force historically work over at the National Reconnaissance Office. We're also sharing programs. We were going to build a program on the Air Force side when we were still in the Air Force that wasn't going to meet our needs, and the NRO was building a capability that would. And so we killed ours and shifted dollars to them. And so that integration is really, really strong. What's driving us together largely is the threat. And so if you look at the NRO mission set, the NRO has its distinct mission set. DoD space has its distinct mission set. And where we come together is in this protect and defend. Going forward, I think we need to broaden that relationship even greater. And that if you look at the mission sets now that smaller satellites are more operationally relevant, I think there's areas or room for the Space Force to be in for example, some of the tactical ISR mission areas. And so you're going to see that relationship continue to be one of the strongest. And again, we operate very seamlessly with the NRO.
So thank you for that. I read very recently that a bipartisan group of House lawmakers announced the creation of Space Force Caucus, focused on advocating for the new service and educating lawmakers and staffers about the service's objectives and priorities. And then the Senate likewise established its own Space Caucus about a month ago. And so obviously, they're serving to advocate for U.S. Space Force and the vital role that the new service plays in maintaining space power, as you've discussed. What specific advocacy do you believe would be most important in the earliest days of the stand-up of the command in your relations with Congress?
Yeah, so, first of all, back on 20 December when the president signed the National Defense Authorization Act, he signed our birth certificate. And so Congress, with bipartisan support, wrote this act that again, established our service. And we've had really strong bipartisan support as we've gone forward. I have told both House members in the House of Representatives and members in the Senate that we want to have a very close partnership, and that we frequently provide them updates going forward. In fact, in the law, it mandates updates every 60 days. We're overachieving on that front. I don't want any daylight as we build this service. The Congress gave us a lot of homework right up front. The first thing that they said to do was develop an independent acquisition strategy for space, and we've done that. They told us to do a human capital management plan, and we've done that. They told us to do a study on how to best integrate the reserve component into this service. We've done that. And so we are working very, very closely with Congress on those, and on just standard programmatic issues, and providing greater fidelity on the challenges and the threats that we currently see in space. And so as we look to build this service, we have an opportunity, again, to start with a clean sheet of paper. We want to be really bold in that vision, and it's going to require support from Congress, and we're working very closely, keeping them informed on the work that we've done.
So thank you for that. You mentioned that the overall galvanizing point with the stand-up of U.S. Space Force is that of protect and defend. And although space is a global commons, it's also a domain of intense international competition. You alluded to that in your remarks as well. So how do we maintain, just maybe a couple of high-level thoughts, our competitive edge over a rapidly growing Chinese space program that I've read, and you would probably know much better, is assessed to overtake or at least compete directly with the U.S. and Russia in 5 years? Is the U.S. Space Force pursuing partnership with members of the EU, for example, for innovation and combined advantage beyond what we have with the today's International Space Station? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. We are working. So first of all, we're the best in the world. Along with our partners, we're the best in the world in space, and that shouldn't be lost on anybody. The reason why the Space Force and U.S. Space Command was established was because competitors were moving fast. This is a critical part of the national defense strategy, and to compete, deter, and win. And so our job is to make sure that we don't get overtaken, that we stay ahead of that threat. And I'm convinced that we're going to be able to do that. We're going to do that in very close partnership with our partners. I talked about before, just a little bit ago, that we didn't have the partners that we needed in space, or we didn't have partners in space historically, because on the military side, because we really didn't need them. We are working that very, very hard. In fact, when we stood up U.S. Space Command, when we planned that command, I established a combined force space component command out of Vandenberg. So the operational component to U.S. Space Command is a combined command, first time ever. We have opened up significantly more training opportunities for our allied partners. We play war games together with our allied partners. We're developing norms of behavior with our allied partners. We are now looking to not just we share data broadly with our allied partners. Our operation centers are connected together. And in the future, not just in the future, and today, and more so in the future, we want to share programs. And so we just, for example, came up to an agreement with Norway to put 2 hosted payloads on Norwegian satellites. That saved us almost $900 million. And because their satellite program was a little ahead of us in timing, it will get us capability onto orbit faster than if we would have had to build the satellites ourselves. We're putting a hosted payload on a Japanese, what's called a QZSS satellite, which is a GPS augmentation satellite, putting an SSA payload on that satellite. Again, we're developing the C2 systems together because our operation centers are linked. So I couldn't be more excited for where we're headed with our partners. And we think that's a critical part of this competition going forward.
And likewise, you've been very vocal on the fact that the Space Force needs to be a disruptor innovator. You talked to that again in one of your lines of effort to drive the significant and rapid change that's required, rapid being key, the need for speed. How do you see robotics, autonomy, artificial intelligence advancements, and things of that nature in this digital transformation world that we're living in? Playing in the future for space operations, and what strategic investments in particular around R&D do you believe must be made in the next 2 to 4 years?
Yeah, so not only is it important to the Space Force, my personal opinion is we're going to be leading that effort. It's critical to successful operations in the domain. Just think of the size of the domain. If you look at the UCP for the U.S. Space Command mission, the UCP assigns the U.S. Space Command with an AOR. In fact, when U.S. Space Command stood up, it stood up as a Geographic Combatant Command. It has an AOR, and that AOR is 100 kilometers above the Earth's surface and higher. That is huge. And if you look at the operations that happen in that domain, whether it's military operations, commercial operations, civil operations, or intelligence operations, those operations happen at a speed that is way faster than anything that happens on the sea or on the land or in the air. We're talking, objects in space traveling 17,500 miles an hour just to stay in orbit. If you look at threats that come from the ground, like China did in 2007, launched a missile to blow up a satellite that reaches low Earth orbit in a matter of minutes. And so you can't operate in that domain, in a contested space domain, without the tools and capabilities that you described. And we want to be on the front line of that. Our first big step going forward is this digital engineering to get us the ability to go fast in digital engineering. We want to get industry there with us to help us get there. I think autonomy is going to be a significant piece for the Space Force, and I think reusability is also going to be significant, provide a significant advantage for the Space Force going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that.
The other thing, Bill, I'd say the ability. You've heard the joint forces talk about JADC2. That the ability to connect sensor to shooter. The Space Force developed. We don't have a C2 system that we need in space today. So we've been building this for a couple years, and we built the data infrastructure for that JADC2. All came out of the Space Force, and we call it the UDL. So we are all in on that on JADC2 as well, having the standards to be able to connect sensor to shooter across multiple domains and be able to come up with decisions at the speed that we're going to need them to be successful is where we're headed.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you bring up JADC2. It seems the perfect storm in terms of between the chairman and the vice chairman and all the service chiefs as we understand it. Sometimes you have to pick it up in separate periodicals or whatever, but every service chief is aligned on the need for JADC2 to be successful, stay inside of the enemy's OODA loop, if you will. And so I take it from your comments that as a service chief, you're also very much, to that way of thinking as a number one priority.
I'm sorry, repeat that last bit.
With JADC2 specifically as a high priority from where you sit and you're part of the larger enterprise.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in fact, I would say it's our highest priority.
Okay, great. So again, you mentioned very briefly in your remarks that the Space Force, while a reality now, is just building, clearly under the wing of the Air Force initially in terms of relationship, but now separate and distinct. And you mentioned the resemblance, if you will, to the Marines and the Navy. If you talk to a Marine, they're going to talk about the significance of their independence in terms of their history, their imagery, the perception that people have as Marine, every Marine being a rifleman and so on and so forth. How can you ensure that the U.S. Space Force has a strong, independent, identifiable presence in national life? And do you see that as being significant where you are today?
I absolutely do see it as significant. In fact, Chief Goldfein and I talked a lot about this, and Chief Brown and I continue to talk about it. But when we started this, Chief Goldfein and I talked about wanting to get this right. And he has a story where he talked about he has two granddaughters. They're the same age, and in 20 years from now, when they graduate from the Air Force Academy, one of them's going to join the Space Force and one of them's going to join the Air Force. And if we do this right, these services are going to be built on a foundation of trust. And so we're committed to doing that. The other piece of this, though, is that we are independent. And I laid out the 5 things that we have to do, in my opinion, that you have to do separate if you're going to be an independent service. And so there is that level of independence. And there is a risk that the Air Force could hug us too closely. And so that would not be helpful to us or them. The Air Force is going to need us to be an independent service with the full weight of an independent service to be able to provide them what they need to be able to support their missions, as is all the other services. So as we're planning this, the way the Space Force was constructed in law was that really the only thing that comes into the Space Force are space operators, engineers, acquisition experts, cyber experts, and some software programmers. Everything else we're going to rely on the Air Force for. All the support functions, security forces, civil engineering. We are focusing on the space superiority mission and being able to provide space capabilities to our joint and coalition partners that are assured. And so there's always going to be this close partnership, but we are independent, and we're making sure that we plan this, that we purposefully build that independence where it's needed, and that we rely and where it's not needed, that there's a seamless partnership with the Air Force.
So if I could just follow on there, because your initial strategy doctrine for space power really talked significantly about space superiority as part of that future doctrine. What doctrinal shifts, if you will, do you foresee coming that deviate from the current doctrine established in Air Force or joint doctrine?
Yeah, we've had space doctrine for years, and it was largely, if you look at it, it was largely about taking space capabilities and integrating them into the joint and coalition fight and making those other domains better. And so that largely stemmed from Desert Storm, and from coming out of Desert Storm, where we first integrated space capabilities into the fight in an AOR. It proved very advantageous. And as a young captain at that time, after Desert Storm, General Horner, who was the JFAC for Desert Storm, he got reassigned as the commander of Air Force Space Command. And that was purposeful. That was bringing the warfighter in that just had the experience of just beginning the integration of space into theater operations and trying to take that to a new level. Almost my entire career since that time was spent integrating space into that fight. And we've done done spectacularly. Nobody can touch us on that. I mean, if you look at how we've integrated, there's nothing we do as a joint and coalition force today that isn't enabled by that integration. The challenge is our adversaries have had a front row seat on it, and they are developing threats to deny us that advantage. And so it's no longer good enough just to think about space as a benign domain and how do I integrate space in this benign domain. You have to treat it as a warfighting domain, and you have to look at what else can space do besides just making the other domains more effective. We want to continue to do that, but we also want to develop independent options from the space domain, which we think can help amplify the deterrence message as a beginning.
So how would you imagine or envision planning to use commercial space assets? There's been this proliferation, for example, in the LEO constellations. How comfortable are you with using such assets versus relying on, sort of dedicated military developed and deployed space systems like you'd be used to coming up?
See huge opportunities with that going forward. Historically, where we've leveraged commercial industry is twofold. One is on commercial launch, and if you look at our launch capabilities today, we buy services, if you will. So with both ULA and SpaceX today. The other area that we relied very heavily on is large commercial communication satellites. Those were the things that were viable in commercial industry. Now that technology has allowed smaller satellites to be more operationally relevant, hence the what you just talked about, proliferated LEO constellations, we think there is a great role to be played by those. And so this force design that we're going to develop is all about what's the best orbit to do the mission, how fast can you get it on orbit? What's the cost, and can you protect it? And if you balance those attributes, I think what you're going to see is you're going to come up with a hybrid approach, and it's not just going to be the one-off big, very expensive handmade wooden shoes architecture. It'll be more proliferated architecture that's more defendable going forward.
So.
Let me give you an example. I talked up front about the other thing it does is it helps us go faster. And so if you look at, I mentioned earlier that if we wanted to buy a clone today of let's say a GPS satellite, an exact replica of what we have on orbit today, it's going to take us a handful of years just to do that, just to buy a clone. And commercial industry is building satellites at a pace much faster, much faster, and designing, building, and launching hundreds and hundreds of satellites in months rather than years. We want to capitalize on that business model where it makes sense. Not all mission areas, it doesn't make sense for all mission areas, but in a lot of them it does.
So maybe switching topic a little bit, but I think very much tied to sort of commercial uses in space and a shared responsibility in our national security enterprise. The question comes in from a Commander Mike Bull Trumbull, and I would just, as a service chief, ask for your reaction to this and maybe a few thoughts. He says, you mentioned the intent to establish light, lean, and agile team. Light and lean historically is challenging, given the concern about being realistically achievable in light of the growing great power competition, according to the NDS. And so some might argue it's viewed as a tactic to get on, sort of some kind of funding reality, I believe is the point that he's making. And he's just kind of wondering in terms of the receptance to, funding what you're being asked to do and building out the force, and then, sort of developing a future where we keep our competitive advantage in space.
Yeah, so I think there's a balance. As I mentioned up front, and I believe this in all sincerity, we do not want to be big. I've dealt a lot with commercial industry, and one of the things that I hear every time I meet with the CEO of a innovative commercial industry company is that big is slow, and we don't want to be slow. And the reason why we don't want to be slow is because of the domain in which we operate. I told you we start out, the Air Force had planned for about 8 months before the law was signed establishing the Space Force. The Space Force had done planning, and the plan was to have 1,035 people on the space staff in the headquarters at the Pentagon. And 20 December, I was named the CSO, and I inherited this plan, and I started reviewing it. And I said, okay, what are 1,035 people going to do? I mean, you and I served as partners here on the air staff a few years ago, and there was nowhere near that on the air staff as it relates to space. And so the challenge is you can be too light and too lean, and you can't be effective. But you can be too big, and the challenge is hitting the sweet spot. And I think as we operate in a Department of Defense, you have to have enough mass to be able to operate effectively inside the bureaucracy. But we also want to be a leader of change and be an incubator for change. And so we've whittled that down 40%, that staff down 40%. And we're not even, we're still growing. We've only got a couple hundred folks on staff today. It'll grow to 600 over the next couple of years. On the budget side, we inherited the budget that the Air Force had for space. And so we've already carved that out. And every bit of those dollars are now part of the Space Force dollars. And we've submitted our first POM and first budget to Congress. So it's purposefully being built as being small based on the strategic environment that we face in space. We'll see if we have it right.
If I can press on that, and this is, you'll probably have to correct me to 100%, but it seems as if at least the initial majority of your force came from the Air Force by design, but that is certainly not the long-term plan, right? So the associated subordinate organizations and units, as they are further developed and built out, you mentioned your headquarters size, but what can you share with us in terms of the service complements from the other services, and how large is U.S. Space Force currently envisioned to be in total once complete?
Yeah, so let me start with that last part. Today, on 1 December, when the President signed the National Defense Authorization Act establishing the U.S. Space Force, that night we took Air Force Space Command, which was a major command of the United States Air Force, and we assigned those forces to the United States Space Force. There's roughly 16,000 people that were assigned to that. And then since then, we went across the Air Force and said, okay, what else is the Air Force doing in space that wasn't part of Air Force Space Command? For example, Air Education and Training Command, doing the development pieces for space. We pulled that over. Some intelligence functions we pulled over. Some cyber capabilities we pulled over. I mean, we went through the rest of the Air Force Research Lab capabilities we pulled over. Warfare Center capabilities we pulled over. And so we excised space out of every piece of the Air Force. Now, in doing so, you can't break the Air Force. When you stand up a Space Force, although there was no sheet music on how to stand up a service, because we haven't done it since 1947, there's no checklist. What you couldn't do is break the Air Force. We worked, as I mentioned, really, really hard over the course of the last couple of decades of integrating space into everything that we do. And so now what will happen is General Brown and the Air Force will say, okay, Space Force, I need X number of space experts at the Warfare Center. And then we'll assign those folks back to them for that assignment. So we've done that. The Department of Defense's goal is to have a preponderance of space capabilities in the United States Space Force. We stood up a service for a reason. That also means you can't break the Army and you can't break the Navy. You can't break the Marine Corps in doing so. So we've been going through an effort to study what should come over and what shouldn't come over, so we don't do harm. And we've come up with a really solid plan. We're about the 97% complete. There's a couple little pieces we're doing some more analysis on, and then I would expect a decision here in the very near term of what other pieces will come over from the other services. But you're right, today the Space Force largely has come out of the Air Force with some augmentees from other services to help us get going.
So close to a, sort of a final decision there and some announcements in terms of the other service components.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned early on in your answer to that question about taking piece parts out of the Air Force, Air Education and Training Command. There's a question from a Lieutenant Colonel Sanders within the Space Force as to any plan for an independent education outside of Air University. How is that looking?
Yeah, absolutely. There is. As I mentioned, I think one of the things that you have to do as an independent service is develop your own people. And so what we've done initially, so for example, basic military training, we just had our first 7 recruits that got recruited for the Space Force show up at basic training, and they're basically going through the Air Force basic training, but we've modified it slightly for those airmen as an initial piece. For Air Command and Staff College, as another example, we stood up a couple years ago something called the Schriever Scholars, and we took a seminar that was, don't quote me on the number of seminars, there's like 40 seminars at ACSC, and one of those what became a space-focused seminar. And so they would go through ACSC, but they'd have independent space-focused areas as well. We've doubled that this past year to 2 seminars. We're going to double that again to 4, which gets us to about 40 or 50 folks, and then we're going to split that off as an independent school focusing on developing Air Command and Staff College. We're doing the same stair-step approach for Air War College. We just set up for the first time a seminar focused on space, and we'll do that. You look at Airman Leadership School. Those are assigned at bases in the Air Force. And so if you're on a Space Force base in the future, that Airman Leadership School will be designed to teach you about leadership as it relates to the Space Force priorities. NCO Academy, there's an NCO Academy at Peterson Air Force Base. We're going to make that the NCO Academy for Space Force. And so if you're a member of the Space Force, you will go to that academy. And so none of this, all this can't happen overnight. We can't just flip the switch and say, okay, we're up and running, but we've got an incremental approach to phase those into a independent capability to be able to develop the Space Force leaders that we need in the future. And it won't, just like all other service schools, it won't be all space experts. We'll have Air Force and Army and Navy and Marines and coalition partners in that class with us as well.
So a similar question, and maybe a softball. Can you tell me, in terms of the service acquisition executive, has that decision been made? Is it separate and distinct from the Air Force, or is it co-joined for the foreseeable future? Well, how's that developing?
Well, the law is really clear. It says we're going to have separate SAE, and it gives a time frame of when that is. I think that's beginning of fiscal year 23. So that's what's in the law, and that's the way we're headed.
Okay. You've mentioned the need or concern to protect and defend space assets actually as the galvanizing reason for a separate space force. How do you view the trade-off of protecting assets versus making them sort of replaceable, reconstitutable, which is, always talked about as a possible way to skin this?
Yeah, so that's all part of this force design, Bill, and that's all work that has to be done. And you're right, there's a trade-off there. On, do you build big disposable lighters that you can just launch, and if they fail, you just launch another batch, or are they more significant? And I think again, it has to be thought through as it relates to the mission that those satellites are doing, the orbits that they're in, the threats that they may face, and so all of that then gets rolled into the calculus when you then build this force design. One of the things that the Space Force is working on as we build this design is to bring unity of effort across the department. And so, leading up to the establishment of the Space Force, Congress would highlight the 65 different organizations that had some role in space acquisition. There's like 30 something different organizations that have some kind, either internal to the department or external to the department, that have some kind of role in architectures. And so we really believe you stood up a service for a reason. That service should be the leading voice in that, partnered with all the other. This isn't just, hey, Jay Raymond's opinion is this. It's bringing everybody together and having the analytical underpinnings to support that decision. But we want to get a force design that meets the needs of the Joint and Coalition warfighters that we support, and also is defendable. And that's the hard work that we have going forward this next year.
So for those interested in joining Space Force as you develop out, the force design that you're talking about, can you maybe describe it initially and then the continuum over time as to what we would expect our space operational force to be doing into the future in terms of where they would be deployed to? Are they deployed in place for the foreseeable future? How does that work out for us?
Yeah, so my leadership has been very clear to me at the highest levels. We're building a space force not just for today, but for 100 years from now. People will talk about culture, and even just think about the service that we came from, the Air Force, and what we were like in 1947 compared to the Air Force of today. Right. And so we have to build a service that can do what it needs to do today, but also has the vision of where it might go. So today, largely the forces that we have are employed in place. They're systems that don't deploy. We have capabilities that we do deploy, but the vast majority are employed in place. I do think I get asked this a lot about, do you see a role for Space Force folks in the future in the domain? And I do. I mean, maybe not today or tomorrow or 10 years from now, but I do believe if you look towards a space economy that's going to be, over $1 trillion between here and the moon, I really believe there's going to be a role for enhanced security in that domain. And the role of the Space Force is to provide that stability across the domain, so commercial companies and nations can flourish. And so I wouldn't rule it out. I don't think it's tomorrow, but I wouldn't rule it out that there'll be an increased presence in the domain from Space Force folks going forward.
Well, I would certainly echo that in talking to young people who are fired up about joining Space Force. Some of those are interested because they think they will be deploying to space. And it's actually refreshing to hear that in a future fight, they may very well have that opportunity.
Yeah, one of the cool things, on our birthday on the 20th, our birthday is the 20th of December. One of the things that we're planning, if all goes well, is one of the astronauts that's about to launch here on the next SpaceX launch up to the International Space Station is an airman, and we're looking to swear him into the Space Force from the International Space Station. I hope all goes well on that. But I do see in the future that could be that's a future that would be real. Today, our focus largely is making sure that we can provide our joint and coalition partners the space capabilities they have become to rely on very, very heavily. Those capabilities provide us great advantage, and to make sure that the analogy I use is the light switch. When you walk in a room and you turn on the light, you hit the light switch, the lights always come on. We need to make sure that when you go into the room and you need space and you hit the light switch, it's always there. And so that's our focus. That's competing, deterring, and winning as part of the National Defense Strategy. I think the standing up, the establishment of the Space Force was part of that implementation of the NDS. And I really believe we will provide significant advantage to our nation and to our coalition partners that we deeply respect and need.
So, General Raymond, we're getting close to the end. Probably a question or two more, if you can indulge, if your time allows, and I'll hand back to James Schmeling at the end for a couple of final comments. Back to the discussion around commercial space assets. The DoD is occasionally offering space capabilities to civilians, a great example being GPS, maybe the most obvious example. Do you foresee future defense space capabilities being offered to the public? And if we use GPS as the example, are you comfortable with some of those capabilities basically becoming ubiquitous to the American way of life, or really, the industrialized world's way of life, similar to GPS, such that the dependencies are so critical that you really can't live without it. Any thoughts there?
Of course. I mean, that's space is ubiquitous. Space is fuels our American way of life. It's not just GPS. I mean, think about weather satellites and communication satellites, and that's who we are. And so I absolutely see that continuing going forward. I think as technology advances and we get innovative people thinking about the domain, there'll be even more things that are out there that will provide benefit to the average person on the planet. The average person might not understand just how reliant they are on space.
Mm-hmm.
It's just because the light switch is always on. But I mean, there's everyday human on the planet Earth, if you will, relies on space capabilities routinely. I mean, almost everything that they do with the and GPS is the great example of, it's more than the blue dot that tells you where it is, but it's the timing synchronization for all the information age business that we're in. It's just part of our American way of life. And I believe that there'll be other capabilities that will develop in the future that will do similar things.
So I'm going to do my level best to tie together three questions, all that are really touching on your mission sets. One, talking about and confronting the emerging, they call them gray area tactics by our competitors in space. And then, just doctrinally around the various priority mission sets, if our space assets are attacked, what kind of retaliation could be considered, and where, how does that develop over time, where you're building a command today, but then you get to space tactics and answering some of these very tough doctrinal questions. And just in general, the distinct missions that you see as your priority as you step through the continuum of space missions that are out there for you to satisfy.
Yeah, so first let me, there's been, and this is kind of common, that people blur the lines between a U.S. Space Command and a U.S. Space Force. And I think one of the reasons why it was blurred is for the first year, I commanded the U.S. Space Command and was the service chief. But there's two distinct functions. One is the one that does the warfighting and conducts operations. And then on the Space Force side, we organize, train, and equip to provide those capabilities to the combatant command. Our job is to make sure that I can provide the capabilities that the combatant commander needs to be able to and not just U.S. Space Command combatant commander, but all the combatant commanders that provide the capabilities that they need to conduct their missions on the. And so that's a full spectrum set of missions, and it's everything from birth to death. I mean, it's launching, it's developing satellites, launching those satellites, making sure that they work when they get on orbit, making sure that they don't run into anything while they're on orbit, that we can track them, making sure that we can integrate those capabilities, again, integrating sensor and shooter and across the joint and coalition force, to protecting and defending those capabilities while they're on orbit, which is largely new business since the threat has emerged, and then at the end of life, deorbiting those to keep the domain safe for all. And so that whole spectrum from cradle to death is what we're focusing on, and we're focusing on providing capabilities that our nation needs, again, for American way of life and for American way of war. Everything from on the U.S. Space Force side, communications, GPS, missile warning, space situational awareness, weather, launch capabilities, space control capabilities, that whole suite against that whole spectrum of operations.
So I thought that asking a clunky question, trying to tie together three, would help us get that elaboration. So I really appreciate the distinction between your responsibilities for OT&E and that of the warfighting commanders. With that, I will simply wrap up as moderator and thanking you for the transparency and the willingness to, pretty much touch on every topic that the audience brought up today. I think I've exhausted my list of questions, and you've been straight on with them. And so thank you for that. James, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. First off, General Raymond, thank you. That was one of the most informative discussions that we've had. The questions from the audience were outstanding. It's also one of our best attended webinars. And so clearly there is a strong interest in this. And I think that it represents the overlap between the private sector, government, and DoD, and the importance of all of these partners for space. I think the distinction between Space Command and Space Force is exceptionally important, and I think that answered an awful lot of questions. I'd also like to thank you, General Bender, for your moderation today. The informed aspect that you bring to this was exceptional, and I appreciate that. We may have some follow-ups with you in the future. We are very excited for you to have spent some time with us, and I know that the NDU students, faculty, and staff gained a lot from this. So thank you very, very much for all of this. To our audience, thank you for joining us. We'll have more sessions coming up after the beginning of the year. We are wrapped up mostly for this year. There's a very busy couple of months with a lot of other things happening, but we appreciate all of your participation, and please feel free to follow up with suggested topics and other areas for us. Again, thank you to everybody. Thank you, Admiral Rogi. Thank you to the Foundation board members and to our sponsors for this series, Leidos and Vion. I appreciate you all very much.
Thank you, sir. And I appreciate the opportunity. I'd be happy to participate in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
Yep.